During the winter days, I like to knit cozy socks for me and my family. It always amazes me that you can create something wearable with one single thread. This year, I want to spruce things up and decided to also embroider my socks. In this video, I'll show you a simple way to embroider flowers on your socks too. I'm using hand knit socks here, but you can also use any kind of store-bought woolen socks. There are two types of woolen embroidery thread that work great for this project. The thin one on the left is crewel wool and the thicker one on the right is tapestry wool. Both of them will felt in the washing machine, so only use them if you intend on washing your socks by hand or on a wool setting with your machine. Washable alternatives are sock yarn that is normally used for knitting or your trusty 6-stranded embroidery floss made of cotton. Now let's begin. I'm using a big tapestry needle with a blunt tip for everything here. When stitching on hand-knitted textures, you can't just make a knot in the back to start your thread. It would only pull through. So here is my preferred method of anchoring embroidery thread in this situation. First, make a knot at the end of your thread. Then stitch from the inside to the outside and back. Move the needle through the thread right before the knot and then pull tight. This way the thread is secured with a loop. With that out of the way, let's make a woven rose. Use the knitted stitches as a grid to get the spacing of the 5 base stitches right. Remember that you always need an uneven number of base stitches to ensure the weaving works in the next step. The regular rose has 5 stitches. For smaller ones you can reduce to 3 stitches and for very big roses increase to 7. I would not recommend to stitch too big because this will make it difficult to maintain the flexibility of the knitted structure. This is also why you have to be careful with tightening the thread. If you leave the base stitches too loose, the weaving will look weird later. If you tighten the threads too much, the knitted stitches will gather up. Make sure that the thread of each stitch lays flat on the knitted stitches and doesn't have a lot of room to move either. Now on to the fun part. Bring the needle up between the base stitches near to the center. Then weave over and under the base stitches and repeat this round after round. The rose should slowly appear. I'm using the thicker tapestry wool here. As you can see, the rose very quickly grows due to the thickness of the thread. This type of thread produces a thicker rose too. If you want your flower to be flat, use crewel wool, sock yarn or 6 strands of embroidery floss. When your woven thread has covered the ends of the base stitches, move the needle under the woven parts. Weave the thread back and forth on the inside of the sock. Snip off the end and there you have the first flower. Now I don't want a free-floating rose on my sock, so here is a way to make a stem with simple leaves. Switch to green thread. I anchored the end of the thread in the back of the rose. You can use the same method like before or weave the end into the back of the existing rose. I'm adding a good old stem stitch here. The stem stitch is quite flexible and therefore works great with knitted structures. Always remember to move the working thread down before making the next stem stitch. I hold it here with my left thumb. To avoid stitching through both layers of the sock and making it unusable, keep your left hand inside of the sock. This creates a bigger gap between, so that you are not as likely to stitch through all layers accidentally. It is still better to check the back every now and then. It is not fun to realize that you have sewn your socks together after everything is finished. To be extra sure, you could also cut out a piece of cardboard or use a postcard to insert into the sock as a divider. For the leaves, I'm using a lazy daisy stitch, or also called single chain stitch. Make a short stitch on each side of the stem stitch. Use the knitted stitches as a guide to get the length about the same for both leaves. I go into much more detail with the stitches used here in my stitch lexicon videos. The ones used here are linked in the descriptions. For socks, you don't want to have long threads on the inside that you might step into and rip. So move the thread up for the second pair of stitches. Wrap your thread around the existing stitches on the inside of the sock. This way the thread is secure in place and you don't have to end and start a new stitch. Stitch the second pair of leaves and weave in the end of the thread. If you only want to embellish the outer side of the socks, like I did here, keep in mind that you'll have to stitch on the outward facing side on the other sock too. If you lay both socks on the table, the upper side and the side facing the table are the ones to embroider on. There are many more flower embroidery videos on my channel that you can use for embroidering socks. Make sure to check them out too. I wish you a lovely week. Until next time.